we go. Have a record of all this. All right. All right, welcome everybody to the September Community of Practice for the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center after a bit of a break. And we're also coming back with something kind of interesting, a little bit different. This occasion, we're not focusing so much on social co-ops specifically, but rather we're talking to the author of a new book, David Harlley, which certainly encompasses co-ops, but also is a very interesting and kind of provocative way of framing the larger issues here, which of course we all naturally get involved in one way or another. So it's very useful, very helpful to kind of think for a moment about how we frame this work, because I think, as everybody knows, there are a lot of different ways to go at that. So we're going to talk about David's new book today, and we're just going to have kind of an informal conversation about the different themes of that. And David and I will talk a little bit and we'll open it up. But let me introduce David just briefly, and then David, please amend or adjust anything I say as you like. He is the CEO and co-founder of ThirdWay Capital, that's based in Toronto. It is an impact venture investment company. They're focused on small and medium enterprises in the region of sub-Saharan Africa. David likes to describe himself as a problem solver who feels challenged and excited by the possibilities offered by the African continent and African entrepreneurs as their stories arch upwards. He is also teaching in an adjunct capacity at IE Business School. The course is about employee ownership structures, the case for more small businesses, and antitrust, anti-monopoly. So this will be a conversation about alternative economics. That's my favorite brand, business for good, and impact investing. So David Harlley, welcome.
Thanks, Les. Thanks for everyone else on the call.
Yeah, all right. Let's see. How about we start this way? I would love to know, maybe on a little bit of a biographical angle, what sort of life experiences and what sort of light bulb moments did you have on the way to creating the vision behind the book in your earlier experiences and so on? Anything in particular?
Yes, I would say probably a couple. I just remember being, a younger person, probably, as far back as my early teens, and living in a big noisy city in Africa, Accra, Ghana, and then obviously having exposure to the West as well. Thinking about what I spent time in Europe, for instance, and I'd spent time in some of these smaller towns that had more self-contained economies that allowed for organic relationships to form at the level of transaction. And so you would go into your village grocery, you would go into your village butcher. You knew who they were. They knew who you were, and so that stirred something in me really early. Just, I suppose, a love for the small, or value for the small. Someone growing up in the big cities feeling like there was something missing. There was something missing, and that we were being kind of stretched apart by just this scale and the requirement of doing life within that scale. Obviously, at that age, you don't really make any connections with economic theory or anything like that. It was simply a thought about what would it look like to build a town, a city, to build some construct of community that will allow people to flourish. I would say move into 2016, 2015, when I was applying to business school, and the question that they asked in sort of this essay you had to submit is what would your perfect city look like? And it was exactly the question that I'd been grappling with as a younger person. I thought, okay, I think I have some thoughts on this. I don't know why this would be valuable at all to a business school, but I'm just going to put down, my thinking around that. And so I wrote this essay on, it would be one that was basically grounded on community and connection and people's ability to be human. It would necessarily contain diversity, not just in the ethnic sense or the gender sense, but more so diversity of experience. And you get that diversity when you have lots of small. And so instead of having big box stores in every corner, you'd have more small sole proprietorships that would allow you to have varied experiences, to experience various products and services, and to relate at the level of passion, which I think is something that I felt was missing. So gone to business school, left that essay behind, didn't think much about it. I did business school in Spain, and over that time, I merged with so I was raised Catholic, and I merged business school with more of an interest in Catholicism that I'd had in the previous decade. And as I pursued that, I found out that there's actually some pretty fundamental thinking on this type of economy that's come out of sort of the late 1800s to the early 1900s. It's all been sort of codified and described. And so there was no need to reinvent a wheel, so to speak. I mean, there was pretty extensive work and thinking to draw from on this. And so I spent the following years just diving into that, the works of Pope Leo XIII, Chesterton, and then eventually, Kelso is not related to that movement, but I imagine he drew from some of that. Hilaire as well. And then ultimately ended up teaching in this space. I pitched a course to the university, and I said, this is probably the most challenging thing that I can think about in terms of alternative economics and stretching that. Would you be interested in positioning this within your undergrad? And they went for it. So those have kind of been the formative experiences for me, growing up in Ghana, Accra, in the anonymous, then applying for business school and having to revisit some of my thinking, and then again being introduced to some decades old now religious thinking along those lines.
We have something in common, which is that I also discovered third way economics through reading Chesterton, who is not thought of as an economic thinker at all. And his movement in Britain didn't get terribly far politically. It had a little bit of intellectual influence, but he's somewhat forgotten. Maybe more relevant in the American context or the North American context is Kelso. And, I have to admit, I haven't dug quite far enough into him. Everybody knows or often know that he's sort of the father of the Aesop movement. But it was Nathan Schneider that was pointing out to me he's much more than that. He had many ideas, more ideas than he could possibly have implemented, So I wonder if you might say just a little bit about how he has influenced your thinking, because he certainly comes up in the book. And so I'd love to have a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I think in Kelso, I found in the Aesop, I found a model that you could have a conversation around. I think if you talk to 10 people about this, 9 out of 10 of them are not going to want to talk at the conceptual level for very long. They're going to want to actually talk about, practicalities. How does this actually work? What does it look like? I think Kelso gave this field an example of how this can work. Obviously, co-ops have existed for time immemorial, and so there was that. But people have often relegated co-ops to the small, haven't really seen them as having potential to become the underpinning of a nationwide economic strategy, let's say. And so things like the trust-based system that Kelso based the Aesop off of, then open that conversation up for me, and then to take that into the school environment and to actually build models and show that there's financial sophistication in getting this to work. This isn't just conceptual fuddy-duddy stuff. There's a whole industry waiting to be built around diverse ownership. And so, yeah, Kelso was the beginning of that for me. I think it's is one of the things that we have to work at in this community, those that believe that this is the way forward, is just figuring out how to get to the first movers.
Mhm.
And often it comes to having something practical to show them, to kind of say, these are practical research results. This is what governance structures could look like. This is what retirement accounts could look like under the ESOP, et cetera. So that's
Yeah,
what.
yeah. Okay,
Um,
let's go then to the book and your inspiration for writing this. Could you tell us a little bit about what you were thinking about as you were planning the book and where you wanted it to go and so on?
yes. So the book started out as, myself taking a bit of a break from teaching, but wanting to keep engaging with these ideas, but also wanting to leave something of a legacy because I wasn't really sure. My full-time job is pretty all-encompassing, lots of traveling between North America and Africa. I wasn't really sure how much lecturing was going to be a part of my life in the short term. And so I thought,
Mhm.
all right, this is something I can control. It's not a teaching schedule. It can be on my terms. So let's see what that would take. And the good thing is, having taught the course, I already had a structure that evolved pretty easily into what turned out to be the structure of the book.
Mhm.
Um, what I wanted to do, and I referred to this in the introduction, was rather than provide an argument, sort of an ironclad argument, almost from a purely logical framework of, hey, if we balance this equation out, this tells us this is the only way forward. I don't think you make progress with something as big as an economic idea, with really complex ideas. I think how we come to them is we look at them from a variety of different angles.
Mhm.
So I wanted to look at this idea from the angle of politics and power, from the
Mhm.
angle certainly regulation, environmental regulation and beyond, from the angle of what it might do for macroeconomic risk, micro risk, um, certainly from the angle of what our day-to-day experiences could be if we shifted to a model that emphasized the small and emphasized local ownership. And the whole treatise was, if something satisfies enough different different views of it, then you start to converge on something that feels truthy or
Mhm.
feels valuable. And that's sort of how we make decisions day to day. When you meet your future spouse, I think what happens is you get to see them in different scenarios and you build faith or confidence in the fact that a long-term relationship can result. And I think there are other areas of life that we make decisions not so much just through logical progression. Yes, logical progression, but you have to see kind of the whole. And so that's a premise for my approach to the book.
Yeah. Mhm. Okay. Um, let me ask whether you see in Canada, I mean, Americans would naturally think of this question. We think of Canada as a more liberal political entity. In particular, I know Matthew and I have done some research on Quebec, and Quebec has something they call a social economy. And
Mm-hmm.
so they have organizations that bring together nonprofits and co-ops and land trusts and so on in a pretty positive way, high impact way in the government conversation, the provincial conversation around regulation and policy and all of that. Is there anything that you see in the Canadian model that you think could be helpful um, in terms of rethinking where we're going in the States?
Um, so I would say the first thing is, yeah, thinking about Canada, you do have to almost think about it as French Canada and Francophone Canada and Anglophone Canada. Uh,
Yeah.
there, there are pretty big cultural differences.
Hmm.
Um, so Anglo Canada takes a lot of its cues from, the US, from the UK. And so there's sort of a continuum there. And what you
Hmm.
see, for instance, we have just over the last 2 years, we just got into place our first EOT, Employee Ownership Trust, and it borrows heavily from the US and the UK models. And so in some regards, we're actually behind the US and the UK in that sense. I wouldn't think that there's too much to offer. I would say certainly on the Francophone side, yes, that rich connection to their French roots, some would say pseudo-socialist roots, just allows them to take a broader view. I wouldn't characterize distributive capitalism as socialist, but certainly there are aspects of it that lean into that kind of disposition. And so I would say the French Canadians have freed themselves up to look beyond neoliberal economics. Most people there do not think in that sense. In terms of concrete systems that might be worth borrowing, what you referred to, certainly to the extent that it's transferable to the various states, there's value there in looking at these social cooperative movements that are happening there. But I haven't seen anything done at scale. Now, these are all very important, and I don't mean to diminish that, but I think the next frontier, so to speak, is to see these sorts of transitions done at scale, and that's where I think the trust systems that we're playing around with in Anglophone Canada, the US and the UK have a lot of potential. But you certainly need both. I think the biggest thing that French Canada would offer is just the mindset, is just that fluidity of thinking, and just the emphasis on the social, analyzing results beyond just your bottom line or what have you, and actually looking to build into analysis and understanding of the externalities of operations. That comes much more naturally to them than it does here in Anglophone Canada.
It's a little bit like the Basques and Mondragon. We don't often look too closely at that cultural factor, but it surely is part of the success of Mondragon. And I was in a call with a woman who works for the Chantier de l'Économie Sociale in Quebec. And in the middle of the conversation, she was making a point about their sense of solidarity. And she said to me, and this was really striking, she paused and she said, here in Quebec, we have a we. And I thought, oh, that's a lovely way to put it. There is a sense of solidarity they have there. It's obviously kind of a slightly nationalistic thing, as it is in the Basque country as well. But there are moments where it comes in very handy, and in North America, and particularly in the States, we have a great problem with finding or recovering the we, which leads me to another good point you make, which is about the relationship between the economy and democracy. And you make the point that democracy cannot be fully achieved until the marketplace is democratized, which is a great point, and one in which I don't think many democracy activists necessarily quite get. Could you say a little bit about your point there?
Yes. So if you think about the role of the government, whether it's a large or small government, it doesn't make sense outside of the marketplace. I mean, one of the primary roles the government plays is to ensure private property and to protect private property. You look at regulation. That's obviously something that the government's responsible for. You look at things like, the fiscal decisions that governments have to make. So there's an interaction that's always ongoing with the private sector. There's information that goes back and forth that allows the governments to make decisions, whether it be on curtailing some of the externalities of the marketplace or what have you. But crucially, as we all know, the interaction goes beyond that, which is that private actors are allowed to, especially in the US, are allowed to not only lobby, but actually support political candidates. And so that's an awful lot of power. And you might argue that perhaps if you have a more level playing field where that power is more distributed, you get more voices in
Yeah.
that conversation. Right now, what we have is I think probably as an extreme a polarization as we've ever had in terms of who gains access to political power and who has their
Yeah.
views and who has their positions taken up in the houses of Congress and the Senate. And I think, you know, especially over the last, let's call it 8 years, it's become, I mean, that's always been true, but it's becoming lay understanding now, where the common person is understanding that lobby activity affects them directly.
Yeah.
Um, it's, you know, I use the image sometimes of, and not to get too political here, but I use the image of a Tesla parked on the White House lawn as kind of
Yes.
a very clear, you know,
Yes.
kind of extreme example of where it is that we're going. But some would argue that we've been here for a while. It just so happens that our current situation allows those layers to be peeled back so we can see what actually does happen. And so far from thinking that we live in sort of we've pushed the needle on democracy to its fullest potential, I think we've got a lot of work to do, and a lot of that work will mean addressing ownership and addressing distribution of power at the level of the private sector.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a curious thing, isn't it? Because you're obviously quite right about the polarity. You also make the point in the book that you're hoping at least that this will come across as a bipartisan proposal, which is very striking. I think I agree with you, and it's a very odd thing that could even be possible. But say a little bit about your reasons for feeling there's a kind of a bipartisanship around these ideas now, or something of one.
Yes. So the opportunity here is to bring on board a system that hopefully is a both end. To say that, you know, part of the West's opposition, and now, if you like, the you know, the right's opposition to big government is there's this sense that human agency or independence is in conflict with that. And the larger your government, the larger your control setup, the less agency and is offered to the individual.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so this system would solve for that because, you know, whereas a socialist system would basically empower the government to make decisions, to make economic decisions on behalf of the population, this actually puts the power in people's hands because you're going to be an owner, I'm going to be an owner. We make decisions. It's a communal decision, but it isn't centered in the state. It's centered in individuals. And so that individual agency is retained under this kind of system. But it isn't done at the expense of the community. It's done, you know, because that's the fear on the side of the left, or is basically that this separation of the classes effectively, that you have these people that exercise their agency at the expense of everybody else. And as capital concentrates, you see that the outcomes of that are worse and worse and worse for the working class. We're saying, well, we're for capital, we're for free markets, but we're against the concentration of capital. And so a dispersed capital should solve for that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. You make the point in the book about scale, and I'm interested in this because it comes up particularly when I was looking at the Italian economy, which I think sometimes has been characterized as a kind of a middle-sized economy. They don't have very many large dominant platforms as we do. They are even somewhat kind of instinctively opposed to that kind of bigness, and which means that they have, in many ways, a very small to middle-sized and highly entrepreneurial economy, which is very close to, I think, your image. I wonder if, when we're thinking about for example, Kelso's pillar of limitation.
Mhm.
How big is too big?
Mhm.
Even recently, Google seems to have gotten past the regulators in pretty good shape just in the last couple of days, one more time. So bigness is still okay to some degree in this country. But
Mhm.
what are your thoughts on that problem and the degree to which scale really matters in these economic discussions?
Yeah. So I would say, this scale question, it's a nuanced one. So there isn't inbuilt opposition to scale. It's it's really opposition to scale at the expense of the consumer.
Yeah.
And so you take, for instance, a country like Canada, you'd be shocked to learn that we have something like five grocers. We have three cell phone companies. We've got two airlines. And so
Yeah.
it's a highly uncompetitive environment. And as much as there's a lot that Canada has going for it, that choice just isn't there. And that affects everything from the quality of goods that we enjoy. It affects the power of the labor force in terms of wages and benefits and what have you. It affects price, certainly. Just in the inflationary period we just went through, Canada performed particularly badly. There was lots of price gouging going on because we didn't have the competitive landscape to rein in some of those excesses. And so, yeah, the idea that, and this is unfortunately, it's the legacy of classical economics, this
Mm-hmm.
idea of economies of scale, and that somehow scale isn't neutral. So I wouldn't say scale is bad. I think scale is um, it, scale has trade-offs. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we've come to see it as being not just a good thing, but almost a necessary.
That's right.
Because
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you're able to look at the economy holistically and look at the externalities of scale, I think if you balance the customer's interests, if you balance the interest of the workforce, if you balance the interest of the environment against whatever economies of scale, if you're able to prove those, I think you draw up a different set of conclusions than what we've had in the past, which is scale is good and big is good.
Yes.
Here in North America, we probably suffer also a bit more because we've got this beast of a stock market which actually incentivizes continual
Mm-hmm.
growth. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you're a CEO that's working for Apple, your earnings have to keep going up and up and up, whether or not you can justify them. And so we've got that problem as well, which that culture isn't as embedded into Southern Europe, your Spain, your Portugal, your Italy as much. And so companies do have the wherewithal to say, well, we think we're big enough. We think we're doing what we set out to do.
Mm-hmm.
Our being paid well, our workforce is being taken care of, and that's enough. And so, I would say it isn't just a case of better antitrust and better antitrust implementation. That's certainly a big piece of it, but we ought to look at our incentives as well. And right now, all our incentives are pushing this scale at all costs. So I find that problematic as well.
Yeah. Nicole Potter has a good point here that relates to that about how your findings intersect, and you mention these in the book, with concepts of degrowths, systems thinkings, limits to growth, donut economics. Could you say a little bit about those movements?
Yeah. So those are movements that I think are obviously bring a level of diversity to the conversation. I think each of them have something to offer. There are indices like the Happy Planning Index as well, which I find useful.
Mm-hmm.
I think where I believe the ideas of distributive capitalism set themselves apart is they're perhaps systemic in a way that those are not. And so donut economics is about imposing limits.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so there's a theory about carrying capacity of the planet and what have you, and that's great. But how do you actually actualize that without a high level of regulation, sort of a bottom down approach. And
Mhm.
that's sort of the challenge that I have. Love all of those ideas, but they often do require a bottom down approach, whereas I'm really pushing here for, sorry, a top down approach. Forgive me. I'm really pushing here for a bottom up approach. That
Yeah.
is actually being is actually being propelled by people at the level of a local enterprise or local industry. They're regulating themselves and their company locally, because they're feeling the effects of the company in the communities that they live in and what have you. Empowering people to do that, the hope is that it's first of all, it's more actionable because regulation comes with a big, it's just hard to do. And if you're going to and you've seen it in the ESG space, where I'm not against the ESG space, but it just comes with a lot
Yeah.
of work. Needs to be a lot of capacity. Is it sustainable? Time will tell. But if we can create democratic marketplaces from the bottom up, then
Yeah.
hopefully you have something that is self-sustaining.
You make an interesting point that I don't think I've ever seen anywhere else relating to bottom up governance. And for example, in the case of co-ops, self-governance, if it's done properly and the little miniature system you've built works the right way, that really takes the place of or provides an important force for good governance and good operation, and really kind of lessens the burden of regulation if these smaller enterprises are operating in a truly democratic, equitable way. And so that's a great benefit I hadn't much thought about. But as opposed to a model where you've got something that's much more kind of aggressive and maybe individualistic and you know thinking day and night about how to evade regulation in order to simply drive up profitability and so on. So I
Mm.
think that's really a good point. Let's ask Santiago to come in with his question.
Yeah, hi. I haven't read your book, and I apologize for that. And maybe you were planning to get to this, but how, if at all, does your model of the enterprise relate to the broader political system, or is it entirely independent?
Right. Are you speaking perhaps to whether or not a government would need to mandate distributed ownership, or could you be a bit more?
Well, that's one thing. I mean, how would you go about promoting it, and what would be the mechanisms? But no, I was thinking of there's this whole idea of community ownership, where you have cooperatives, which are partly worker owned and partly the community has some sort of a voice or a stake, and maybe there's some interaction going in the other direction. Anyway, all of
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I mean, certainly, you know, both at the level of local politics and at national politics, I think, over time, again, if we see a flattening of wealth gaps, so to speak, I think you will see that start to play out in our politics as well. You will see that candidates at local level and at national level are more reflective of people's choices because you've got more distributed wealth or influence. So that's one piece. In terms of the actual result on the political landscape, I think we alluded to it a bit earlier. Just it's one aspect of how polarized our politics are. And I wouldn't say it's the only aspect. We certainly got all sorts of culture wars and have you, but certainly at the heart of a lot of the increasing gap is just this idea that we can't sit around the table on this issue of how we deal with things like taxation, how we and so taxation being a system of redistribution. What we're offering is a system of pre-distribution that says the
Yeah.
conversation should go beyond just how much should we be taking from the wealthy to give to the disenfranchised. Actually, let's enfranchise people from the get-go. Let's solve the problem at core, and
Mhm.
and let's build that build an economy that recognizes and pursues that. Then I think you have less fraught discussions around that. So that hopefully helps to close the gap as well. I know that someone like I believe Harris started to talk about it towards the end of her campaign, but
Mhm.
didn't leverage it near well enough to really set that party in a new direction. And
Right.
so everything that I turn on, whether it's Janet Yellen or Powell or it's whether it's CNN or Fox, it's this tug of war around redistribution, which I think is getting quite tired.
Yep.
People are realizing that is the toolkit is exhausted. It isn't doing what we hope that it would do. And so we need something fresh and something new.
Hmm. Hmm. Let me ask my colleague Matthew to come in here. I know he actually previously we thought he might need to MC today because of my schedule, but it worked out that I could be here. But I know Matthew's had a chance to look at the book also. So Matthew, come in if you like, and let's have your thoughts.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, great to meet you, David. I'm Matthew Epperson. I'm based in Georgia, United States, but I've been working quite a lot in the sort of cooperative space for a long time. And one of the things that was really striking to me from your book, you use the word, let me just get this quote right. Um, you say that this is specifically referring to sort of the capitalization of worker cooperatives. You state that the primary reason for this is that these models are usually a requirement for employees to purchase shares. And you state that this has been problematic, not least because in the vast majority of larger enterprises, employees simply do not have the resources to purchase a meaningful stake in the company. I found that interesting, so my experience, to your point about sort of the direct democratic engagement of a lot of these enterprises, such as worker cooperatives, they're typically able to influence those decisions for themselves, such as like how much equity they can even contribute into those particular purchases. So I thought, could you say more about what you were indicating about this sort of problematicness?
Yes. Yes. So it's funny enough, I actually retracted that in the final print. I'm not sure which one that you've got.
Hmm.
So there is some nuance there. I would say, yes, you're right. A lot of worker cooperatives have solved that problem and they create schemes to allow employees to buy in, or sometimes not to buy in. Sometimes the buy-in is not required. I think the limitations are more around just the scale and then the administrative friction that creates for um for attributing ownership and what have you. I think that's more of an impediment, not unsolvable, but I think if you're going from a company of 50 or 100 and you're now thinking about companies that hire tens of thousands, then that becomes an easy out for a company to say, well, no, we can't run that kind of system because administratively, having direct ownership is too much of a hurdle. Having said that, we've seen, for instance, in Mondragon, that it is doable. Um, um, and so, yeah, my conclusion wouldn't be that a co-op has hard limits to scale, just that there's friction to scale that makes it so that the trust system is just a bit more sellable if we're trying to mainstream ideas um, of broad-based ownership. The trust system is just easier to sell in the marketplace.
Sure. And well, maybe I can ask one more, then Jerome can go if that's
Sure,
okay.
sure.
Yeah, so actually kind of related to that. So I also noticed in your, and I apologize if this is another version difference, but you were also sort of tracing different types of direct versus indirect ownership. And one thing I've noticed sort of working in this broader span of sort of, big tent employee ownership is this kind of move toward what is sometimes called direct employee ownership, which is usually a way to refer to mass distribution of shareholding, which is sort of a different flavor rather than, necessarily like a little bit more like, I guess, what tech companies and like what you describe as sort of like partnerships and profit sharing via direct share ownership. There's a particular group called Tandem that's been very trying to be influential in this space in the United States from the success of a company called Cargus, where they were able to practice this kind of direct share ownership. So I was wondering if that also rings as like another way that you're thinking about sort of the plurality approach and different ways of trying to sell this idea of distributed ownership.
Yeah, yeah. So I think what's for me, and yeah, there are going to be differences on terminology, like in terms of what comes to mind when you think direct ownership. For instance, when you think about a co-op, you immediately think about full democracy, right? But direct ownership does not guarantee you that. They're under a partnership, you don't necessarily have that. And so there are probably other different ways to categorize that depending on what your emphasis is, make things more or less clear. I think that really what we have to give is just this diversity of options. Is to say, because I don't know how much time you spend talking to others in this space, but one of the biggest problems we have is there is actually a lot of friction between folks that are pro ESOP, folks that are pro employee ownership trust, folks that are pro co-op. And I was really surprised and discouraged to see that is people will sometimes refuse to work with one another because they really back one form or the other.
Well,
and so, yeah, the attempt there is to sort of just say, here's your menu. Here's the things that are available at the moment, depending on your scale, depending on your level of maturity as a company, this form may work better for you or not. And, without getting too technical, there are others that have done much more technical work around this. It was more to just kind of say, this isn't new. This isn't untested and untried. There are all kinds of different ways in which we see employee ownership already in society. And there's a rich menu to pick from. And let's not, quibble too much about which is the best, because it's totally dependent on the type of business you're running.
Yeah, that's good. I see we have Jerome Warren with us. Welcome, Jerome. And you've got a question. Please come in.
Can you hear me? It might be loud in the background. I can go outside if that's the case.
No, we're okay. We're good.
Okay,
How you doing?
I'm fine, doing better. I've been very busy. It seems like a couple of years now, so finally finishing up some projects that have been taking up so much of my bandwidth. Elias, as you know, some books that we're putting out. And by the way, in the upcoming book that we finished the manuscript on, that's going into copy editing, or it's in copy editing now. There's a chapter by myself and several co-authors on the kind of what was just said, this divergence of interest in the worker or employee ownership scene and then cooperative scene on the other hand, that these are two movements that could be working better together, but they're not. And what are some kind of insights into best practices that could be drawn on actually to facilitate that? But I wanted to go back to this notion of scale. And I think that scale is oftentimes a false, a red herring. And in fact, it goes back to the economization of social science and even the kind of a path dependency of economics in the way that it evolved in the 20th century. And if you go back to the beginnings of neoclassical economics, you see Alfred Marshall was talking about what he called industrial districts, thickly populated industrial districts. And Marshall was actually of the belief that a lot of the efficiency gains of large companies could be recreated, so to speak, by groups of smaller enterprises. And in fact, you do see in places like Italy, I know Mondragon was mentioned as an example that can combine scale and also democracy, but look at Italy and the industrial district, where you see sometimes they're cooperatives, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're just family businesses that actually share the production of particular goods. It could be furniture, it could be jewelry, it could be different things, even social services. And they're small enterprises, but collectively together, they can actually act at scale similar to a multinational company. And that's a really fascinating phenomenon that I think often doesn't get the attention that it deserves. I just wanted to throw that in.
Jerome, you're talking about it's sometimes called the Emilian model, right?
No, I mean, yes and no. We have a word in German that's yes and no, jein. So the Emilian model is one variant of this, but I would say this is a more general model that is common to much of specifically northern Italy, and a lot of the companies are not cooperatives. The difference of the Emilian model is that you have the industrial districts, for instance, like in Imola, but then the companies are mainly or primarily cooperative. So, but Yeah, it's a general model that had been adopted in the beginning of the 20th century with industrial or late 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and basically a kind of a neighborhood model of business, or a community model of business. It doesn't necessarily just involve co-ops, but some variants of it do, like in Emilia-Romagna.
Oh, very good. And please, by all means, if you could drop in the chat that German word that means yes and no. I definitely want to hear about this.
It's the word for yes is ja, and the word for no is nein. So it's just a combination. It means jein.
Okay, very happy to have that. All right. Any other thoughts here? This book, by the way, I want to sort of encourage everybody to realize this is not a massive tome that David has done. He's managed to talk about all these subjects, the macro and the micro, in about 100 pages, right, David, or a bit more. So it's quite a manageable book, but it opens out in sort of all kinds of directions. Maybe one quick thought that I had, and again, you limited the scope of the book, so I can understand why you didn't go further. It isn't only your book. The one question that comes to mind is, though we need economics to recover our politics, because economics is in some ways, bad economics has devoured our politics. But what should the new politics be? I'm not talking about parties. I'm not talking about voting. And you get into this a little bit, but what would a vision of the politics of the new city look like? Could you say maybe a little bit about that?
Yes, that's that's a tough one.
I know it is. I agree.
So I think the first piece is to recognize that if you're going to build a city that's truly sort of embracing democracy at the market level, there's risk to that, and that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, potentially that changes the tenure of politics, because there's a lot of fear baked into our politics now, and that fear leads to a desire to control, et cetera, et cetera. I think that having having sort of a step away from ivory towers, so to speak, of established norms of wealth and power, and basically opening up the conversation to all swaths of society, it's probably the biggest step that we can take to start to redeem how we think about even the role of politics in our lives. What should it be? What should the role of government be? And everyone's invited to that conversation. But what it means then is that even folks like us who have some sense of what this city could look like almost have to be careful about that, because that's the implication, that everyone is invited to the conversation, for better or for worse. And so that's something that I think has occurred to me, to sort of say there's a humility that's required on both sides, on all sides, that's going to be very important for whatever there is to come. At the moment, as you can see, the conversations are pretty entrenched, and they're in pretty prescriptive camps that don't allow for conversations that don't fit into those. I think if we're going to pursue real diversity, then that humility has to be a part of it. And so I tend to stop short of saying what politics could or should look like, because I think then that puts me in for exactly that reason. The closest that I can come to it is to say, if the political brass has seen one of their primary has seen opposition between economics and the marketplace, or has seen a line between the social and then the economic, at the very least, we should see a blending of those two worlds, where there's a recognition that the sole responsibility of the marketplace, financial or Main Street or whatever it is the flourishing of humanity. if you can start having conversations at that level, then I think politics gets much, much, much more interesting. I think then you don't have groups splintering so easily, because there is a commonality about human experience that ought to bring us together and ought to allow us to have better conversations. But that's as far as I can get with that.
Very good. Very good. All right. Let's see if we have anybody else. I see we have Brother Remy Wood with us. Remy often has interesting things to throw in. Remy, you want to jump in for a second?
Well, I may just say from, interior Alaska,
Yeah.
The meat of this conversation over the last few generations and what it is from top-down governance to community engagement and bottom-up, like this is very, very fresh. And with the president of the United States and the president of Russia meeting here on the ground, just that, the economy of the inability for trauma over generations to be able to be surfaced is a part of the infrastructure movements and choices that is a part of our electrical grids, our food service, our political realities, not just in Alaska, but as we're trying to then relate with one another and the rest of the United States and North America. So the importance of all this time is already so well lived, like in Madrigal in Italy and how many other areas. And so I get to say, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you all are doing what you're doing, because it's needed and it's so, so valuable. So from this area and this bottleneck.
Yes.
Oh, thank you all for being here today and for all what you're doing in your communities.
All right. All right. Thank you, Remy. Good. All right.
So just one more thing on your last question, which I do think is crucial, is if you're asking my personal bent here, I think that subsidiarity, I don't know if you're familiar with that word.
Very much.
Is a big part of where you would sort of hope that the political
Yes. Yep.
Much more of an emphasis on empowering the local population as opposed to ivory towers like we have now.
Yeah. I would say, I guess, though it's not a political party, there is an impulse toward a greater localism and in a sense of taking control, at least in our local communities, of our own stories. And in some ways that may have been spurred by realizations during COVID that we don't feel power at the local level, and yet it's really the only playing field we have. And maybe the other piece of that that's emerging is something about well-being and care is part of that politics as well. And those are interesting and powerful, but they're not organized into any kind of formal party at the moment. Maybe that's coming down the road. Maybe one last question, David. What are you hearing about the book so far? Where do you think the book is pointing you in terms of future work and future efforts, if you can tell?
Yes. So the response so far, I think the most common response I've gotten so far is I felt like I could have written this book. And I love that response because one of the goals was to really push on stuff that, I related earlier how when I was, growing up, I felt this sense that there was a better way to do community, that the size of cities was eroding that. I think that's innate in most people. And so part of what I was trying to achieve was to push on something that we've allowed to die. And so getting a response from people saying, I feel like I could have written this book. What I'm hearing is these feel natural, these feel organic, these feel like the conclusions we would reach if we were allowed to have a voice in this conversation, as opposed to simply being, shuffled around by the powers that be. So I think that bodes well for the idea in general that we're not trying to bring in ideas that are foreign to human nature. We're actually, we have a leg up in that these sorts of ideas should feel quite natural to us, should feel like, of course, as opposed to aha. And I think, of course, ideas have a lot of power.
Very good. Interesting. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
All right. Super. So we dropped the links to your book in the chat there. All good luck on the further rollout of the book. And we will maybe have this conversation again down the road a bit, because I think you started up something very interesting in this conversation. Folks, we'll be meeting in October, the first Wednesday of the month, as usual, at noon EST. And in the meanwhile, thank you very much to David Harlley. This has been great.
Thanks very much for having me. All the best.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
This is being recorded. It'll be on our Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center YouTube channel. So if you want to refer it to anybody else, you'll be able to do that. All right. Thanks all. Peace.